The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and scorched earth before she even stepped into Dusty Gulch. Eliza Monroe, 30 years old, shaded her eyes against the glaring afternoon sun as she guided her horse down the rutted main street. Dust swirled around her boots, clinging stubbornly to the hems of her simple linen dress. The town's wooden buildings leaned precariously against the horizon like tired old men, their paint peeling under decades of sun, wind, and rain. From the moment she saw Dusty Gulch, she felt a tension that prickled her skin, a quiet anticipation, as if the town itself were holding its breath. She had not come here by choice. A letter, hastily written and smudged with ink, had summoned her to this place. The previous bride had disappeared without a trace, leaving Colton Drake, one of the wealthiest and most formidable ranchers in the region, without a wife on the day he was meant to be married. And so Eliza, an ordinary rancher's widow accustomed to solitude and independence, had been summoned as the last-minute replacement bride. The irony was not lost on her. She had spent years avoiding entanglements men, townsfolk gossip, and the kind of life that demanded vulnerability. And yet here she was, riding into the heart of Dusty Gulch. A stranger expected to step into someone else's life as if she belonged. Her horse, a sturdy bay mare named Daisy, snorted nervously as the wind kicked up behind them. Eliza patted the horse's neck. "Easy now," she murmured. Her voice was calm, but her pulse thumped faster than usual. It wasn't just nerves, it was instinct. Something about this town felt off. A boy, no older than 12, emerged from the shadows of the general store. His clothes were worn, dusty, and patched, but his eyes were bright with curiosity. Miss, you're the replacement, right?" he stammered, glancing at the saloon doors. "Mr. Drake, he's waiting." Eliza dismounted, dust kicking up around her boots, and offered a small, reassuring smile. "I suppose I am," she said, her tone steady. "Lead the way." The boy nodded quickly and scurried ahead, opening the saloon doors with a creak that echoed in the hot, dry air. Inside, the smell of whiskey, tobacco, and horse sweat mixed in a heady haze. The saloon, though modest, had seen better days. Faded wallpaper peeled at the edges, and the piano in the corner sat silent and slightly warped from years of neglect. And then she saw him, Colton Drake. He stood near the far wall, his silhouette broad against the sunlight streaming through the front doors. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, but the sharp line of his jaw and the set of his shoulders marked him as a man used to control, used to commanding the world around him. His dark eyes, however, betrayed the unease beneath the surface anger, worry, and a hint of disbelief at the situation he'd been forced into. Eliza squared her shoulders and met his gaze. "I'm Eliza Monroe," she said, extending a hand. Though neither of them seemed inclined to shake it, Colton's eyes flicked to her hand, then back to her face. He studied her as though trying to see through her, past her calm exterior. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and deliberate. "Eliza," he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. "I wasn't expecting anyone. I can see that," she replied dryly, but not unkindly. "Neither was I." The ceremony that followed was swift. Dusty Gulch's small chapel had been prepared weeks in advance for a bride who now no longer existed, leaving the town's minister little choice but to proceed with the replacement. The pews were filled with curious onlookers, townsfolk murmuring speculation and excitement, while outside, the wind kicked up dust that danced across the sun-baked streets. Colton and Eliza recited the vows, their voices steady but unpracticed. Neither had expected this. The bride had vanished. The groom was wary, and the replacement, an ordinary rancher with no connection to him, had suddenly been thrust into a role neither had imagined. Yet, even as the minister pronounced them husband and wife, The air between Eliza and Colton was charged with unspoken questions. Who was this woman? Why had she come? Could a stranger step into a life so fraught with danger and grief and make it her own? After the brief ceremony, Colton insisted she ride with him to his ranch, 20 miles west of the town, across desert plains and rugged terrain. The sun hung low as they rode, casting long shadows over the mesas and canyons that surrounded them. Eliza noticed the careful, almost protective way Colton held the reins, scanning the horizon for threats she couldn't yet see. "It's a long ride," he said finally, breaking the tense silence. "Not many make it through this stretch without trouble." "I've handled worse," she replied. Her voice carried quiet authority, born of years surviving the harsh realities of ranch life. She had driven cattle through sudden thunderstorms, nursed sick animals with little more than determination and hope, and faced down men who underestimated her because of her age and gender. This desert, this man, this strange new role, it was nothing she hadn't faced before. As night fell, the desert transformed. Shadows stretched across the plains like living things, and the wind whispered through canyons and over mesas. When they finally reached the ranch, the farmhouse appeared like a solitary sentinel, framed by the pink and purple hues of twilight. Lanterns flickered faintly in the windows, casting warm but fragile light against the encroaching darkness. Eliza's instincts, honed over years of solitary living, screamed caution. She dismounted slowly, listening to the crunch of gravel under her boots, the low whinny of horses in the corral, the distant howl of a coyote. Colton's hand brushed hers briefly as he passed to secure the horse. A silent acknowledgement that danger, or at least uncertainty, was in the air. Inside, the farmhouse smelled of wood smoke, leather, and hard work. The furnishings were simple but sturdy. A large wooden table scarred by years of use, chairs with rickety legs, and shelves lined with jars of preserved food and tools of the trade. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of unspoken stories, of a man who had built this life with his own hands, but had suffered losses too deep to articulate. Colton moved about the room with precise efficiency, lighting lanterns and checking locks. "We're not expecting visitors," he said quietly, more to himself than to Eliza, "but it never hurts to be careful." Eliza nodded, taking in her surroundings. She could see why he had survived the harsh years of the Old West. Everything was practical, every tool in its place, every precaution accounted for. Yet beneath the surface, she sensed loneliness, a longing for something or someone that had been absent for far too long. That night, as the wind rattled the windows and stirred the dust outside, Eliza found herself lying awake on the cot in the guest room. Her mind replayed the day's events, the boy in Dusty Gulch, Colton's cautious glances, the minister's hurried ceremony, and a deeper, more insistent thought. She had not come here for adventure. Yet adventure had found her anyway, somewhere in the darkness. Colton was doing the same, perhaps staring out a window at the same moonlit desert. Neither spoke, but a silent acknowledgement passed between them, a recognition that this marriage, this union born of necessity, was not ordinary, and that in the unforgiving landscape of the Old West, they would need to rely on each other in ways neither could yet imagine. The wind picked up outside, carrying the scent of sagebrush, dust, and distant danger. It whispered secrets of the desert stories of men who had fallen, fortunes lost, and lives forever changed by a single misstep. Eliza closed her eyes, letting the sounds fill her, her hand brushing the edge of the quilt. She didn't know what awaited her in Dusty Gulch or on Colton's ranch, but she knew one thing: life, as she had known it, had just ended, and something new, wild, and unpredictable had begun. And just beyond the rim of the desert hills, unseen eyes watched. The missing bride, the gang she had fled from, and a danger that thrived on opportunity waited patiently. The first battle of this reluctant partnership had not yet begun, but it was coming. And neither Eliza nor Colton would be ready for what the desert had in store. By the time dawn broke over Dusty Gulch, painting the land in harsh gold and deep shadows, Eliza knew her life had changed irrevocably. She was a bride, yes, but more than that, she was a survivor, a stranger thrust into a man's world of danger and responsibility. And the desert, vast and indifferent, had only just begun to test her. The morning sun burned over Colton's ranch like a relentless furnace, painting the arid plains gold and shadow. Eliza awoke to the smell of coffee and leather, the distant whinny of horses, and the faint clatter of breakfast preparations in the kitchen. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply breathe, feeling the warmth of the rising sun on her face, the wind teasing strands of her dark hair. But there was no time to linger. The events of yesterday, the hurried ceremony, the uneasy ride across the desert had left her restless. She knew instinctively that Dusty Gulch's troubles weren't over. Colton emerged from the barn, wiping sweat and dust from his hands on a rough leather rag. His dark eyes found hers across the yard, and for the first time, Eliza noticed how the early light softened the hard lines of his face. Despite the scars, the weight of responsibility, and the grim history in his gaze, there was something undeniably magnetic about him, someone who had built a life from grit and danger. Someone who commanded respect simply by existing. "Morning," he said, his voice low but carrying an edge of amusement she hadn't expected. "Sleep well?" "I managed," Eliza replied, brushing dust from her dress as she stepped into the yard. "Though I suspect I won't get much more rest with the way things are out here." Colton's jaw tightened. "You're right about that. Things aren't going to calm down for a while." He paused, glancing toward the eastern horizon. "I got word last night, Ryder. One of the town boys says the Thornton gang has been spotted near the old creek bed. They're scouting." Eliza's heart quickened, though she forced a calm tone. "Then we should prepare." "Do you have a plan?" Colton nodded slowly. "We'll set up traps along the eastern approach, keep the horses ready, and make sure the perimeter's secure. I don't intend to give them any advantage." Eliza's eyes scanned the land. The desert was wide and unforgiving, dotted with scrub oak and jagged rocks, a perfect hunting ground for those who knew how to read it. She felt a thrill she couldn't quite explain, a mixture of fear, excitement, and the undeniable surge of adrenaline that came with danger. "I can help with the traps," she said, "and I know how to move quietly. The land can work for us if we use it right." Colton looked at her, measuring. "You've got guts," he said finally. "I like that." He offered no further praise, but there was respect in his gaze, hard-won respect that Eliza knew she'd earned through action, not words. The day passed in a blur of activity. Eliza learned the rhythm of Colton's ranch, quickly feeding the horses, checking fences, reinforcing windows, and strategically placing rudimentary traps along likely approaches. She marveled at the precision of his methods, the way every movement had a purpose. He spoke little, but every gesture revealed years of experience, a man who had faced hardship and loss and survived. She found herself silently admiring him, not just for his skill, but for the quiet determination that ran beneath the surface. As the sun dipped low, painting the desert in fiery oranges and deep purples, a rider appeared on the horizon, dust trailing behind him like a storm cloud. Eliza squinted, recognizing the boy from Dusty Gulch. "Ryder, they're coming," he shouted as he galloped into the yard, nearly out of breath. "The Thornton gang, they've been spotted moving east, closer than we thought. They're planning something." Colton's hand went instinctively to the holster at his hip, though his eyes never left the horizon. "Good work, Ryder. Get the rest of the town watch ready. Eliza, we need to make sure nothing comes through the south and west approaches. Can you handle that?" Eliza nodded. "Consider it done." The following hours were a tense ballet of preparation. The ranch's perimeter was reinforced with heavy wooden planks. Sharpened stakes were buried along likely paths, and horses were readied in the corral for a rapid response. Eliza moved with quiet efficiency, surprising herself with how natural it felt to be part of something larger than herself. To fight alongside someone whose trust she had earned in mere hours. Night fell, and the desert wind picked up, rattling windows and carrying distant howls across the plains. Eliza and Colton sat on the porch, watching shadows dance across the rugged landscape. They spoke little, yet the silence was comfortable, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of the wind or the shifting of a horse in the corral. "You handled yourself well today," Colton said, finally breaking the quiet. His tone was measured, but there was a hint of something warmer in it. Eliza turned to him, a small smile on her lips. "I had a good teacher," she said, though her eyes twinkled with amusement. "And besides, I don't scare easily." Colton's lips quirked in the faintest smile. "I can see that." He hesitated, then added quietly, "You're different from what I expected. Stronger." Her breath caught slightly. She had expected suspicion, maybe even wariness, but not admiration. "I didn't come here to impress anyone," she said softly. "I just came to survive, I suppose." "And you have," he admitted, his gaze lingering on her in a way that made her stomach flutter. Unexpectedly, their moment was interrupted by a sudden shout from the corral. Both of them sprang to their feet. A shadow moved along the edge of the property, one of the gang scouts, perhaps testing the defenses. Colton's hand rested on his revolver as he moved silently toward the figure, and Eliza followed. Every muscle tense. The figure bolted at the sound of their approach, disappearing into the darkness. But the warning was clear. The gang was close, and the night would be long. Over the next few hours, Eliza and Colton patrolled the ranch with quiet vigilance. Each sound, the snap of a twig, the distant cry of a coyote, the shuffle of sand, set their nerves on edge. Yet, in the midst of danger, an unspoken bond began to form. Eliza admired Colton's precision and foresight, while he respected her bravery, her quick thinking, and the calmness with which she met every challenge. Finally, in the small hours of the morning, they returned to the porch. The desert was silent, save for the occasional gust of wind. Both were exhausted, physically and mentally, but neither could sleep fully. "You're different from any woman I've known," Colton said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon for threats even as he spoke. "And I mean that as a compliment." Eliza chuckled softly, leaning against the railing. "I'll take it. And you're not what I expected either. I thought you'd be brash, arrogant. A man who relied solely on strength and intimidation." "I rely on strength and experience," he admitted with a hint of a grin. "But there's more to survival than brute force." Their conversation dwindled into silence, the kind that didn't feel empty but shared a quiet understanding between two people who had been tested by life and were learning, cautiously, to trust one another. Suddenly, a distant roar echoed across the plains. Horses neighed, and the faint outline of figures appeared against the horizon dust clouds rising in the moonlight. The Thornton gang had arrived, or at least their scouts had, confirming that the real test of the night and perhaps of Eliza's and Colton's partnership was about to begin. Colton drew his revolver, the familiar weight steady in his hand. Eliza reached for hers, fingers brushing leather, pulse quickening. In that moment, the desert stretched endlessly before them, dangerous, unpredictable, and alive with possibility. "Ready?" Colton asked, his voice low, almost a growl. "As I'll ever be," Eliza replied, a fierce determination hardening her tone. Together, they moved toward the gate, the cool night air carrying the scent of dust, sagebrush, and distant gunpowder. For the first time, Eliza realized that she was no longer just a replacement bride, she was a partner, a defender, a force in her own right. And standing beside Colton, she felt the strange, thrilling certainty that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The first shots rang out as the gang appeared, silhouetted against the moonlit desert. Dust kicked up around hooves and boots, guns cracked, and the night came alive with chaos. Eliza fired instinctively, feeling the familiar rush of adrenaline, while Colton commanded and moved with precision. They worked in tandem, their movements a silent choreography born of instinct, skill, and growing trust. Hours seemed to pass in a heartbeat, and as dawn approached, the gang scattered, leaving behind only traces of the fight, the smell of smoke, the shattered wood of fences, and a sense of hard-won victory. Eliza and Colton surveyed the damage, exhausted but triumphant, aware that this was only the beginning. Colton turned to her, his expression softer than she had seen before. "You did well," he said simply. Eliza wiped sweat and dust from her brow. "We did well," she corrected, smiling faintly. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel not just relief, but something deeper, a spark of connection, admiration, and perhaps even affection. The desert stretched endlessly before them, harsh and unforgiving, but for the first time, Eliza felt a strange kind of hope. Together, she and Colton had survived the night, and if they could survive this, they could survive anything. The sun rose over Colton's ranch, painting the desert in harsh gold and stretching long shadows across the corrals and wooden fences. Eliza was already awake, moving quietly through the kitchen to make coffee, the aroma mingling with the faint scent of dust and leather that lingered from the night before. Sleep had been elusive. Her mind kept returning to the skirmish, the gang, and the way Colton had moved calm, precise, and utterly focused. There was something magnetic about him, something that went beyond brute strength. Colton appeared in the doorway as she poured the coffee, his dark hair tousled from a restless night, the morning sun catching the lines of his face and the faint scar on his left cheek. "Morning," he said, his voice low, carrying that same weight of authority that had commanded the ranch all these years. "We've got work to do." Eliza handed him a mug, their fingers brushing briefly. He accepted it with a nod, his eyes lingering just a moment longer than necessary. "The gang didn't waste time," he said quietly. "They'll be back soon, and they're not reckless. They planned carefully. We need to understand what we're up against." Eliza set her mug down. "Then we start by figuring out why they came. There's always a reason, and it's usually someone's secret." Colton's gaze hardened. The missing bride. That woman was no ordinary town girl. She brought them here, one way or another. And if she's still alive... His voice trailed off. Eliza felt a chill run down her spine. The missing bride had loomed over their lives like a shadow, her absence leaving danger in its wake. "We need to know what she was hiding," Eliza said. "If we can uncover it, we can anticipate their next move." Together they moved toward the barn, Eliza's boots crunching against the coarse sand. Colton followed silently, but there was an unspoken understanding between them. They were no longer just two people defending a property. They were partners in a fight whose stakes neither had fully grasped. Eliza began rifling through crates and boxes that Colton hadn't touched since the last bride's arrival. Dust rose in faint clouds as she carefully moved items aside. And then, in the corner of the barn, half buried beneath a layer of hay, she found it, a small wooden box, locked but easily pried open with a piece of iron wire. Inside were letters, deeds, and a leather-bound diary, worn and scuffed from travel. Colton approached, his gaze fixed on the contents. "Where did you find that?" he asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and concern. "Corner of the barn," Eliza replied, flipping through the diary's pages. Her eyes widened as she read. "She? She wasn't just a runaway bride. She had dangerous debts, and she was planning to escape the gang. Colton's hands clenched into fists. She brought their attention here, didn't she? All of it, my land. This ranch was at risk because of her choices. Eliza's tone softened. It doesn't matter what she did. What matters is that we can use this to our advantage. We know why they're coming. And if we're careful, we can be ready. For the next several hours, they pored over the diary, piecing together the woman's movements, the names of her allies and enemies, and hints of the Thornton gang's planned attacks. Eliza's mind worked quickly, plotting ways to fortify the ranch, anticipate ambushes, and safeguard the horses. Colton, in turn, coordinated with the few trusted ranch hands left, setting traps and positioning lookouts. The air was thick with anticipation and the subtle heat of the desert. But in the midst of it, Eliza and Colton worked seamlessly together. Two halves of a holdout. By late afternoon, the sun hung low, casting jagged shadows across the desert plains. Colton led Eliza to a ridge overlooking the ranch and the surrounding land. "Look," he said, pointing to the distant creek bed. "That's where they'll approach if they're smart. And judging by their actions yesterday, they are." Eliza scanned the terrain. The creek cut a narrow path through the desert, flanked by low cliffs and boulders, perfect cover for an ambush. "We can use the cliffs," she said, her mind already calculating angles and lines of sight. "Place traps near the creek. Force them into the open where we can control the fight." Colton's lips pressed into a thin line, his mind clearly running parallel strategies to hers. "Good. You've got a sharp eye." His tone carried a rare note of admiration. And for a fleeting moment, Eliza caught the softness behind his usual stoicism. Night fell quickly, and with it came the tension of the unknown. Eliza and Colton took their positions near the creek, the diary tucked safely into Eliza's coat. The desert around them was silent, save for the faint rustle of wind through sagebrush and the distant cry of a coyote. Every shadow seemed alive with potential danger, every sound amplified in the quiet. Hours passed, the moon rising high and pale above them. And then the first figures appeared, shadowy silhouettes moving cautiously through the rocks. The Thornton gang had arrived, testing the defenses. Colton signaled to Eliza, and they moved with precision. The first trap was sprung, a net catching one of the gang members off guard. A shot rang out, and chaos erupted as the gang scrambled, their plans disrupted. Eliza's heart raced, but her aim was steady. She could feel Colton beside her, guiding, protecting, and trusting her in a way that made her pulse quicken. After a tense skirmish, the gang retreated into the night, leaving the desert eerily quiet once more. Colton and Eliza returned to the ranch, exhausted but alive, their bond deepened by shared danger. Inside the farmhouse, the quiet was almost unnatural. Eliza poured a cup of coffee, the steam rising like a small comfort against the tension that clung to her skin. Colton leaned against the doorway, watching her, his expression unreadable. "You handled yourself well," he said finally. Breaking the silence, Eliza set the cup down and met his gaze. "We did well," she corrected gently. There was something in her tone, pride, but also an acknowledgement of the partnership forming between them. Colton's eyes softened, and he took a step closer. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect someone like you to step into my life and handle all of this with such skill and calm." Eliza tilted her head, studying him. "Someone like me? And what exactly does that mean?" "It means you're brave, smart, and unflinching," he said quietly. "You see things clearly, act decisively, and don't let fear control you. I respect that." Her chest warmed at the sincerity in his voice. "I respect you too," she admitted softly. "You've built this life from nothing, protected it fiercely, and faced danger head on. That's not easy." They lingered in the silence that followed, a fragile peace amid the chaos of the desert. Eliza realized how much trust had developed in the past 24 hours, trust born not from familiarity, but from shared experience, danger, and reliance on each other's abilities. Before they could speak again, a faint rustle outside caught their attention. Colton's hand went to his revolver instinctively, and Eliza followed suit. Shadows moved near the edge of the property. Scouts from the gang, perhaps, or someone else entirely. They held their positions, hearts pounding, waiting for the figures to reveal themselves. The shadows disappeared into the night, leaving only the sound of wind over the desert. Colton lowered his weapon slowly, glancing at Eliza. "This isn't over," he said. Eliza nodded, tucking the diary safely into her coat. "No, it's not. But we're ready." For the first time, they allowed themselves a moment of quiet. The desert stretched endlessly around them, dangerous and indifferent, yet beautiful in its harshness. And for the first time, Eliza felt that she belonged here not as a temporary bride, but as a partner, a survivor, someone who could stand beside Colton and face whatever came next. As dawn approached, painting the desert in soft pink and gold, Colton and Eliza stood together on the porch, watching the horizon. "We've survived this far," Colton said quietly. "We'll survive the rest too." Eliza's hand brushed against his, and he didn't pull away. "Yes," she agreed, her voice steady. "Together." Somewhere in the distance, the Thornton gang regrouped, their plans far from over. But Eliza and Colton were ready. They had uncovered the past, understood the danger, and forged a bond strong enough to face the coming storm. And as the sun rose over the rugged mesas, they both knew that whatever lay ahead, they would face it side by side, partners, equals, and perhaps something more. The desert had tested them, and they had passed. But the final confrontation, the one that would decide everything, was still waiting in the shadows. The desert dawn was pale and quiet, but beneath its calm surface, tension simmered like the heat of the sun soon to rise. Eliza stood near the ridge overlooking Colton's ranch, her rifle steady in her hands, eyes scanning the distant hills. The night's events had left them both weary, but there was no time to rest. The Thornton gang had regrouped, and this time they would not retreat so easily. Colton emerged from the shadows behind her, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip. The morning light caught the sweat on his brow and the dust on his boots, highlighting the rugged lines of a man who had fought too many battles to count. "They're coming," he said quietly. Though his voice carried the weight of certainty. Eliza nodded, gripping her rifle tighter. "We've prepared. The traps, the lookout positions, the terrain. They'll regret underestimating us." Colton's eyes softened briefly as he looked at her. "I don't just hope we survive. I trust that we will together." Her heart stirred at his words. This man, who had seemed so guarded, so hardened by life, had begun to open a space for her in his world. And she felt the same pull and unspoken bond that had grown stronger with every skirmish, every shared plan, every quiet moment in the desert night. From their vantage point, they could see the gang moving cautiously across the plains. A line of men in ragged hats and dust-covered coats, carrying rifles and pistols. Colton signaled to Eliza, and they descended into position, using the rocks and shrubs as cover. The desert seemed alive with anticipation, every shadow a potential threat, every gust of wind carrying danger. Eliza's mind raced, calculating angles, distances, and timing. They would need to force the gang into a narrow canyon where the traps they had set would have maximum effect. The element of surprise would be their greatest advantage. She caught Colton's eye, and he nodded. No words were necessary. They were in perfect synchrony. Two halves of a well-oiled machine. As the gang approached the first trap, the net Eliza had rigged sprang, ensnaring one of the riders with a loud thump. A shot rang out, followed by chaos as the remaining gang members scattered, unsure of where to take cover. Eliza fired with precision, her aim steady despite the pounding of her heart. Colton moved with lethal grace beside her, every shot calculated, every movement deliberate. The fight was brutal and fast. Dust swirled in the air, mixing with the smell of gunpowder and the copper tang of blood. Horses reared and bolted, hooves pounding against rock and sand. Yet through it all, Eliza and Colton maintained their focus, their bond growing stronger with every maneuver. They worked seamlessly, anticipating each other's actions, covering angles, and communicating through gestures and subtle shifts in posture. Hours seemed to pass in a heartbeat. The gang, caught in the narrow canyon as planned, had no choice but to confront the traps and the defending pair. One by one, the outlaws fell or fled, their confidence shattered by the precision and tenacity of Eliza and Colton. When the last figure finally disappeared into the dust, the desert fell eerily quiet once more. Eliza lowered her rifle, her muscles trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion. She glanced at Colton, who was leaning against a boulder, sweat and dust streaking his face. For a long moment, neither spoke. Words felt unnecessary. The silence was filled with shared triumph, relief, and something deeper, something neither had named but both felt. Finally, Colton approached, brushing dust from his coat. "You were incredible," he said simply, his voice carrying awe and genuine admiration. Eliza smiled faintly, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the desert sun. "We did it together," she corrected, echoing a phrase they had shared before. He shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. "No, your instincts, your courage, they saved us. I didn't expect to find someone like you." Eliza's heart fluttered. "Neither did I expect to find someone like you," she admitted softly. "I didn't come here to be anyone's bride. But I think I found someone worth standing beside." Colton's eyes darkened with intensity, and he took her hand in his, their fingers interlacing. The desert wind carried their words, whispered promises in a landscape that had seen so much danger, loss, and survival. Their moment was interrupted by a faint sound, footsteps, cautious and deliberate. Both tensed, reaching instinctively for their weapons. But as the figure emerged from the shadows, recognition softened the tension. It was Ryder, the boy from Dusty Gulch, carrying a bundle of letters and maps he had discovered hidden near the creek. "They're gone," he said breathlessly. "But they left these plans, maps, and other papers. Looks like they were planning more raids on nearby towns. You stopped them, but this—" His voice trailed off as he handed the bundle to Colton. Colton scanned the contents quickly, his brow furrowing. "This confirms it. They were more organized than we thought. But with this, we can warn the towns and prevent further attacks." He glanced at Eliza. "Thanks to you, the ranch is safe, the gang is broken, and the townsfolk can prepare. You changed everything." Eliza felt a surge of pride and relief. "We changed it together," she said, smiling. The weight of the past days, the fear, the chaos, the unknown was lifting, replaced by a rare sense of accomplishment and calm. Over the next few days, they repaired the damage to the ranch, strengthened defenses, and coordinated with Dusty Gulch to ensure no further attacks would threaten the town. Colton allowed himself to let his guard down around Eliza, sharing stories of his past, the hardships he had faced, and the loneliness he had carried for so many years. She listened, offering empathy, quiet encouragement, and understanding that came from living a life forged in resilience. One evening, after the sun had dipped behind the mesas and the desert sky turned deep indigo, Colton and Eliza sat on the porch of the farmhouse, the cool night air brushing against their faces. The silence between them was comfortable. punctuated only by the distant howl of a coyote and the faint rustle of sagebrush. "I never expected a last-minute replacement bride to change everything," Colton said softly. His gaze fixed on the horizon. Eliza smiled, leaning slightly against him. "Neither did I," she admitted. "But some things are meant to be." He reached for her hand, holding it firmly yet gently. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know this: I want you here with me for whatever comes next." Her heart swelled with emotion. "And I want to be here with you, not just because of what's happened, but because I see a life worth fighting for. Together." For the first time in years, Colton allowed himself to truly relax. The tension of the past weeks, the fear, the battles, the uncertainty had given way to something enduring: connection, trust, and love born from shared trials and mutual respect. As they sat in the quiet desert night, the ranch secure and the gang neutralized, Eliza realized how far she had come. She had arrived in Dusty Gulch as a stranger, a temporary bride with no claim to the land, the man, or the life unfolding before her. Yet through courage, determination, and willingness to face danger head-on, she had earned a place not only in Colton's life but in the heart of the desert itself. Colton broke the silence, his voice gentle but firm. "Eliza, I don't need another bride. I need a partner, someone who can stand by me, someone I can trust with my life. And now, I can't imagine facing this life without you." Eliza's eyes softened, her hand brushing his cheek. "Then you won't have to. I'm not going anywhere." The wind whispered across the desert plains, carrying away the remnants of danger and uncertainty, leaving only the promise of a shared future. In that moment, the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Old West seemed less daunting. Tempered by the bond they had forged, they remained on the porch until the first light of dawn crept across the horizon, bathing the desert in soft pinks and golds. The ranch was quiet, the horses grazing peacefully, and the town of Dusty Gulch beginning its day unaware of how close it had come to disaster. Yet for Colton and Eliza, nothing would ever be the same. They had faced life and death together, navigated secrets and treachery, and emerged stronger, united by respect, courage, and love. In the days that followed, the ranch thrived. Colton and Eliza worked side by side, reinforcing the fences, tending to the animals, and ensuring the land remained safe. Their partnership became seamless, a balance of strength, intelligence, and shared instinct. And as the desert wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, they both knew one undeniable truth: they were no longer strangers, no longer a man and a woman brought together by chance. They were a team, a family, and a force that could face whatever the Old West dared to throw at them. By the time the sun rose high over the rugged mesas, Colton and Eliza stood together on the porch, their hands entwined, gazing across the land that had tested them, challenged them, and ultimately brought them together. The trials of the past weeks had forged a bond that neither danger, deceit, nor the unforgiving desert could break. Colton turned to Eliza, a small but genuine smile on his face. "We survived. We built this life together, and I wouldn't have it any other way." Eliza smiled back, her eyes reflecting the warmth of the rising sun. "Nor would I. Together, we can face anything." And as the wind carried the first hints of the desert morning across the plains, Colton and Eliza knew that their story, born from desperation and danger, had become something enduring: a life, a love, and a partnership forged in the heart of the Old West, unbreakable and whole.